I have a problem. Well, I've actually got lots of problems, but my specific problem is to do with my headphones. They have a ridiculously long cable that lies on the floor and gets tangled up in the wheels of my chair. I can't imagine that rolling over it is good for the cable, and it's also just annoying, so I want to make something that will keep my headphone cable nice and neat. Shortening the cable isn't an option because I'm always scooting from my computer desk to my workbench for various reasons, so I've got to keep the long cable. As I was rummaging around my box of parts, I found this massive spring, so my first thought was that I could just use this to keep the cable under tension and take up the slack. But this spring is way too strong and would probably rip the headphones straight off my head. I got my next idea from looking at a tape measure. At the press of the button, it could reel the cable back in, but unless I got some fancy spinning electronic connection, this would spool the cable in both directions, so I'd have a heavy contraption right in the middle of the cable, which is a no-go. Finally, in my box of bits, I found these 3 pulley wheels, and I knew I was onto a winning idea. Now, I know what you're thinking. This drawing looks exactly like a face with a big nose, but it's actually just a weighted pulley that hangs beneath a pair of pulleys at the top. So as I pull on the cable, it'll just lift the weight up, and then when the cable comes back in, the weight will go back down, taking up all the slack with it, and leaving me with a nice and clear floor to roll around on as I please. To ease into this, I'm going to start with the weighted pulley, which I'm keeping super simple. It's just a bit of wire holding a section of steel pipe onto the pulley, and if you're thinking this looks a bit dodgy, well, you'd be right. Either way, that's it for the weighted pulley. Like I said, it's super simple, and we can now focus on the top block with the other 2 pulleys, and we can make that out of some scrap pallet wood, which I have in abundance. If you saw my last video, you'll know I don't have an appropriate saw for this, so just block your ears and I'll screech my way through this wood with a hacksaw. With that out of the way, I can figure out where I need to place the holes for the pulley shafts and then drill them out with my trusty hand drill. If you couldn't tell by now, I'm constructing this entirely with bits and pieces I've already got lying around, and apparently what I don't have lying around is the matching nuts for these bolts, so I'm going to have to come up with some other way of keeping the pulleys on. I'm not exactly sure what they're called, but I managed to find these things which have little grub screws that let me clamp them onto the shaft. The only problem is the bolts aren't long enough for them to grab onto, so I need to carve out a bit of a recess for them. Unfortunately, my drill's chuck doesn't open up wide enough for the properly sized bit, so I had to use a smaller bit and then widen the hole with a knife, which as you can see looks awful. But it does drop these down far enough that they can clamp onto the shafts. Of course, the grub screw is now inaccessible, so I also had to carve out a little channel to let me get an Allen key in there so I could tighten them up. And this finally let me secure the pulleys onto the bit of wood. And here you can see another issue, and that's how poorly the pulleys spin, which when you look at the back, you can understand why that's the case. Obviously, there are ways of solving this problem that are a lot easier, such as getting some wireless headphones, but that just doesn't sit right with me. I've already got some perfectly good headphones, and it doesn't make sense to me to throw them away just because they don't exactly fit my needs, especially when I've got the materials and the means to create something that makes them fit my needs. Because then you're not only having fun making the thing, but you also end up with something that is unique and yours. I also think it's cool to just have random contraptions all about the place, and it doesn't hurt that you're saving money while you do it. Back to the contraption, and I need some way of mounting this to my desk. I've got a light clamped on my desk, so I'm thinking I can just use that same clamp to hold the top pulleys in place, and for that I'll need a top plate, so it's back to the screeching banshee saw to cut that out. As I was cutting the bit of wood, the back edge actually split off, and there's another crack running down the side, so you can see the quality of wood that I'm working with. Thankfully though, I don't need the full width of the wood, so I just snapped it off at the crack and used the narrower piece. My salvage screws are a bit too short for this, so again I'll drill some recessed holes for these, and you'll be pleased to know I learnt my lesson from last time and made sure that these screws wouldn't collide with the pulley shafts. Despite all the dodgy bits, the first iteration was done and I could give it all a test, which actually went pretty well. As I pull the cable in and out, it does take up the slack, but you'll notice this pulley is not really spinning as it should, which means the slack isn't taken up very smoothly at all. I ended up just drilling out the pulley so it could spin nice and freely on the shaft. The back pulley doesn't really need to spin though, because the cable there is always going to be stationary. Getting this pulley spinning nicely revealed that the weight I'm using was way too high. Then I tried out this scrap of copper piping, but that was too light. And finally, I ended up with this monstrosity of nuts and bolts, which was just right. After a bit more testing, I found the cable was slipping off the front pulley a little too easily, so with a bit more of the copper wire, I fashioned a little guide to keep the cable in place. With some very awkward hand movements, I could shimmy everything into place and clamp it onto my desk and then feed the wire through. And with that, it was done. You can see the front pulley is spinning like a dream and the weight is just perfect to take up the slack but not rip the headphones off my head. And now I never have to worry about running over my headphone cables ever again, and I can zoom around however I please. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.